It is Tuesday afternoon. It is August the 3rd, and I am here to talk to you this afternoon, an afternoon stream. Welcome, 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 welcome. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. I am about to open up a can of unnamed diet beverage. Trigger warning, it often sounds like I'm cocking a gun, so if that triggers you, be triggered. Doesn't it sound like I'm cocking a gun? I feel like it sounds like I'm cocking a gun every time I open a can of unnamed diet beverage. I'm pouring the can of unnamed diet beverage. We're going to have a stream this afternoon. We are going to have a stream. I'm going to engage with you. Hit the like button. Hit the subscribe button. YouTube algorithms have this weird thing of unsubscribing people. Hit the notifications bell. Always good to hit the notifications bell. Always good to hit the notifications bell. And from there, the way we're going to do this stream is I am going to give my opening remarks, which should be interesting today. And then, well, it's interesting every day, but it'll be particularly interesting today. It'll be a little different than we normally do things, but I think folks will appreciate it. We're going to give my opening remarks. The entire time I'll be clicking my pen and writing down your super chat questions. And then, after that, we do the roll call, where I call you out as I see you, names and locations. I call you out as I see you, names and locations. And then after that, I answer your super chat questions for the rest of the show. That is how the show works. First the opening remarks, then the roll call, and then the Q&A super chat question. So if you have a super chat question, by all means, shoot it to me. I will write it down and answer it in the second half of the show. In the second half of the show. And that is how we will do it here. So hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. I'm about to begin my opening remarks after I take a sip of unnamed diet beverage. Pour some more of it into the cup with ice. Always have to have ice with my unnamed diet beverage. Don't know why, but it's much better if it's a little watered down. You know, it helps. For some reason, I don't like it pure. I like it to be a little bit watered down. And on that note, I will now begin my opening remarks. Folks, there's a quote from Vladimir Lenin that he wrote. It was in his book, The State and Revolution, published in 1917. But it is very, very, very universally true. And it applies to what I'm talking about today. And in fact, it'll basically set the tone for my entire stream today. This is a quote. It's at the very beginning. It is on the first page of Vladimir Lenin's book, The State and Revolution. He writes, during the lifetime of great revolutionaries, and thank you, AJQK, for the super chat, much appreciated. During the lifetime of great revolutionaries, the oppressing classes constantly hounded them, received their theories with the most savage malice and the most furious hatred and the most unscrupulous campaigns of lies and slander. After their deaths, attempts are made to convert them into harmless icons, to canonize them, so to say, and to hollow their names to a certain extent for the consolation of the oppressed classes, and with the object of duping the latter, while at the same time robbing the revolutionary theory of its substance, blunting its revolutionary edge, and vulgarizing it. Think about that. How many times have we seen that? Let me read it one more time. During the lifetime of great revolutionaries, the oppressing classes constantly hounded them, received their theories with the most savage malice and the most furious hatred and unscrupulous campaigns of lies and slander. But after their deaths, attempts are made to convert them into harmless icons, to canonize them, so to say, and to hollow their names to a certain extent for the consolation of the oppressed classes, with the object of duping the latter, while at the same time robbing the revolutionary theory of its substance and blunting the revolutionary edge and vulgarizing it. I can think of no greater example in American history of a revolutionary leader who was hounded his whole life, met with a campaign of lies and slander, but then after his death, turned by the bourgeoisie into a harmless icon. I can think of no greater example of that than the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a socialist. He was a socialist. The leader of the modern civil rights movement was not a Marxist, was not a communist, but he was a socialist. And I have today in my hands quotations from Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. that you have never heard, but you should hear them. And when you bring this up with people, often people will say, sure, once or twice he criticized capitalism. No. This is not a small collection of quotations from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. that I have in my hand. This is quite a bit that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said that they have tried to cover up. In school, we learned about Dr. Martin Luther King as this pacifist, as this patriot, as proof that the American capitalist system was just because, look, he marched for civil rights and everyone cried and he gave the I Have a Dream speech and that proves that America is the greatest country in the world. That's not what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said. And I have here in my hands some quotes from the great Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., whose birthday is a national holiday in the United States, one of the most celebrated figures in American history, that every school child is forced to learn about in school. I am going to read to you what Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, the revolutionary, said. I am going to read to you the actual words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and you can decide for yourselves if he's a harmless, patriotic icon, if he was a Republican, if he was a conservative, or if he was indeed a revolutionary. I'm about to read you Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s words. Again, not passing comments. I'm going to read you quite a bit. Call it democracy or call it democratic socialism, but there must be a better distribution of wealth within this country for all of God's children. 1961, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The evils of capitalism are as real as the evils of militarism and the evils of racism. March 1967. I imagine that you already know that I am much more socialistic in my economic theory than capitalistic. Like most human systems, it fell to the very things it was revolting against. So today, capitalism has outlived its usefulness. That was July 1952. He said, one day we must ask the question, why are there 40 million poor people in America? And when you begin to ask that question, you are raising questions about the economic system, about a broader distribution of wealth. And when you ask that question, you must begin to question the capitalistic economy. And I am simply saying more and more, we've got to begin to ask questions about the whole society. All right, neoliberalism tainting leftism. Again, these are all quotes from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I've barely begun. We are saying that something is wrong with capitalism. There must be a better distribution of wealth, and maybe America must move toward democratic socialism. 1966. You cannot solve the economic problems of the black people without talking about billions of dollars. You cannot talk about ending the slums without first saying profit must be taken out of the slums. Process of small countries joining USSR. Bulgaria. You are really tampering and getting on dangerous ground because you are messing with folk then. You are messing with the captains of industry. Now this means that we are treading in difficult water because it really means that we are saying that something is wrong with capitalism. From Russia. He said that in 1966. We must recognize that we can't solve our problems until there is a radical redistribution of economic and political power. This means a revolution of values and other things. We must see now that the evils of racism, economic exploitation, and militarism are all tied together. You cannot really get rid of one without getting rid of the others. The whole structure of American life, and we must put our own house in order. That was said by Dr. Martin Luther King in 1967. I am convinced that the simplest approach will prove to be the most effective. The solution to poverty is to abolish it directly by a widely discussed manner, the guaranteed income. The curse of poverty has no justification in our age. It is socially as cruel and blind as the practice of cannibalism at the dawn of civilization, when men ate each other because they had not yet learned to take food from the soil or to consume the abundant animal life around them. The time has come for us to civilize ourselves by the total, direct, and immediate abolition of poverty. That's 1967. Dr. Martin Luther King said that in his book, Where Do We Go From Here? 2 weeks before he was assassinated, Dr. Martin Luther King said in his church at Mason Temple, Church of God in Christ, March 18th, 1968, he wrote, "If America does not use her vast resources of wealth to end poverty and make it possible for all of God's children to have the basic necessities of life, she too will go to hell." That's Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. 1966, he was interviewed on 60 Minutes. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "I think we've got to see a riot is the language of the unheard. And what is it that America has failed to hear? It has failed to hear the economic plight of the black poor and has worsened over the last few years." 1967, he gave a speech called The Three Evils of Society. And this is what he said in that speech. He said, "Again, we have deluded ourselves into believing the myth that capitalism grew and prospered out of the Protestant ethic of hard work and sacrifice. The fact is that capitalism was built on exploitation and the suffering of black slaves and continues to thrive on the exploitation of the poor, both black and white, here and abroad. The hour is dark. Evil comes forth in the guise of good. It is a time of double talk where men in high places have high blood pressure of deceptive rhetoric and anemia of concrete performance. We cry out against welfare handouts to the poor, but generously approve of oil depletion allowance for the rich and richer. What they truly advocate is socialism for the rich and capitalism for the poor." If you really want to hear some radical rhetoric, go and read Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s Beyond Vietnam speech that he gave in 1968 at Riverside Church in New York City. The fact that we've all been told Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a harmless, patriotic icon, that he was somebody who proved that capitalism and America are the greatest systems in the world. If you go read his Beyond Vietnam speech, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King proclaims that the government of the United States is the greatest purveyor of violence on earth. He calls for a revolution of values. He says that all over the world, the poor people and the hungry are rising up, and that it is our duty in the West to support these revolutions. Dr. Martin Luther King was a radical, not a Marxist, a Christian, and a pacifist, but definitely not an advocate of capitalism. I just read you quote after quote after quote, where he condemns the capitalist system. He condemns the greed of the rich. He calls for what he called democratic socialism. Dr. Martin Luther King was a radical, and he was an anti-imperialist. Go and read his Beyond Vietnam speech, where he basically sympathizes with the National Liberation Front and the communists of Vietnam and their fight against imperialism. Martin Luther King Jr. was a radical, and the fact that they've tried to turn him into a harmless icon is definitely something to be angry about, because he was definitely not a harmless icon. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a revolutionary. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., let's not forget, was shot down on a picket line. I mean, it was his hotel, but why was he in Memphis, Tennessee? Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was there to support a group of striking workers. The sanitation workers of Memphis were on strike for better wages and better working conditions. There was a strike going on in the city. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. went to the city of Memphis, Tennessee to support the striking workers, and that is where he was gunned down. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was shot down in the class struggle, fighting for the working class. And at the time of his death, he was leading the Poor People's Campaign, a campaign against poverty. And he was opposing the Vietnam War and declaring that the USA should withdraw from Vietnam and allow the people of Vietnam to control their own country. He said that American capitalism and militarism were the greatest evils facing the world. He called for a revolution of values. He called for moving toward democratic socialism. Martin Luther King Jr. was a revolutionary. So do not let them tell you that he was a patriotic icon, that he was just this. He's proof that the capitalist system in America is good because, look, we let him march. And don't tell you that. He was gunned down and murdered. There's a lot of questions about his death that are still out there. The Martin Luther King Jr. family has won settlements in court against the FBI. The COINTELPRO program of the FBI was used to destroy his reputation, accuse him of being a Soviet agent, accuse him of being a homosexual. And yet he prevailed, and now he's one of the most beloved figures in U.S. history. And he's a socialist. He was a socialist. He was an anti-imperialist. He was a revolutionary. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a revolutionary. Don't let them deceive you about who Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was. MLK's view on Christianity and communism. Write it down. On Christianity and communism. I wanted to open by talking about Dr. Martin Luther King and reading you those quotes, and reading you that quote from Lenin about how they turn revolutionaries into harmless icons. But I'm going to go back even further into history. All right. Saif Gaddafi. Libya presidency. I'm going to go back even further into history. And I'm going to talk about another revolutionary figure who's been widely maligned and misrepresented. And that would be Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus Christ. And the Christian teachings and the Christian religion contains many revolutionary phrases, right? This is a very radical book of socialist propaganda I have right here in my hands. You actually read the words of the Bible, if you don't let it be interpreted for you by Joel Osteen or the Pope, but you actually read the words of the Bible, it's quite revolutionary. And here in my hand, I have a list of quotations, a list of verses from the actual Bible, the actual Christian Bible, about the view of wealth, the view of oppression, the view of the working class, religious opposition to progress. And I'm going to read those quotes to you. Again, all of these are quotations from the Bible about wealth and labor and exploitation. Some from the Old Testament, most from the New Testament. I will read them to you. I just read you the quotes from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Now I will read you the quotes from the Holy Bible. Do not mistreat or oppress a foreigner, for you were foreigners in Egypt. Do not take advantage of the widow or the fatherless. If you do, and they cry out to me, I will certainly hear their cry. My anger will be aroused, and I will kill you with the sword. Your wives will become widows, and your children fatherless. If you lend money to one of my people among you who is needy, do not treat it like a business deal. Charge no interest. And if you take your neighbor's cloak as a pledge, return it by sunset, because the cloak is only covering your neighbor is the only covering your neighbor has. What else can they sleep in? When they cry out to me, I will hear them, and I am compassionate. Right? Malcolm X. Socialist ideology. And that's Exodus 22, 21, 27. Next, if your brother becomes poor and cannot maintain himself with you, you shall support him as though he were a stranger and a sojourner, and he shall live with you. Take no interest from him or profit, but fear your God, that your brother may live beside you. You shall not lend him your money at interest, nor give him your food for profit. That's Leviticus 25, verses 35 and 37. Do not lend at interest or take any profit. Withhold his hand from injustice. Execute true justice between man and man. That's Ezekiel 18:8. No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. That's Matthew 6:24. And Jesus said to his disciples, truly, I say to you, only with difficulty will a rich person enter the kingdom of heaven. Again, I tell you, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God. Matthew 19:23 and 24. He has shown strength with his arm. He has scattered the proud in thoughts of their hearts. He has brought down the mighty from their thrones and exalted those of humble estate. He has filled the hungry with good things, and the rich he has sent away empty. That's Luke chapter 1, verses 51 through 53. And he answered them, whoever has 2 tunics is to share with him who has none, and whoever has food is to do likewise. That's Luke chapter 3, verse 11. And if you lend to those from whom you expect to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners and get back the same amount. But love your enemies and do good and lend nothing, expecting nothing in return. And your reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High, for he is kind to the ungrateful and the evil. Luke chapter 6, verse 34 and 35. And they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine and fellowship, and in the breaking of bread and in prayers. And fear came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were done by the apostles. And all that believed were together, and had all things in common, and sold their possessions and goods, and parted them to all men, as every man had need. And they, continuing daily with accord in the temple, and breaking bread from house to house, did eat their meal with gladness and singleness of heart, praising God and having favor with all people. And the Lord added to the church daily such as should be saved. That's Acts 2:42 through 47. All the believers were one in heart and mind. No one claimed that any of their possessions was their own, but they shared everything that they had. With great power, the apostles continued to testify to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus Christ, and God's grace was so powerfully at work in them that there were no needy persons among them. For from time to time, those who owned land or houses sold them and brought the money from the sales and put it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to anyone who had need. That's Acts chapter 4, 32 through 35. Now listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that is coming on you. Your wealth has rotted, and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like a fire. You have hoarded wealth in the last days. Look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cry of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. You have lived on the earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the innocent one who was not opposing you. And that's James chapter 5, verses 1 through 6. If anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. It's 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 8. For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pangs. That's from 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 10. And let him that stole steal no more, but rather let him labor, working with his hands the things which is good, that he may have to give him that need. Ephesians, the book of Ephesians, chapter 4, verse 28. When the Lamb opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, "Come." And I looked, there before me was a black horse. Its rider was holding a pair of scales in his hand. And then I heard what sounded like a voice among the four living creatures say, 2 pounds of wheat for a day's wages, and 6 pounds of barley for a day's wages, and do not damage the oil and wine. That's from the book of Revelations, chapter 6, verses 5 and 6. Then the kings of the earth, the princes, the generals, the rich and the mighty, and everyone else, both slave and free, hid in caves and among the rocks of the mountains. They called to the mountains and the rocks, "Fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who can withstand it?" That's from the book of Revelations, chapter 6, verse 15. And after I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was made bright with his glory. And he called out with one mighty voice, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling place for demons, a haunt for every unclean spirit, a haunt for every unclean bird, a haunt for every unclean and detestable beast. For all nations have drunk the wine of passion of her sexual immorality, and the kings of the earth have committed immorality with her, and the merchants of the earth have grown rich from the power of her luxurious living. And then I heard another voice from heaven say, 'Come out of her, my people, lest you take part in her sins, lest you share in her plagues. For her sins are heaped high as heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities.'" That's the book of Revelations, chapter 18, verses 1 through 24. Now, when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down, and his disciples came to him, and he began to teach them. He said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be fulfilled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, They put it on a stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. And in the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your good Father in heaven. That's Matthew chapter 1 through 17, the opening of the Sermon on the Mount. And finally, obviously, my favorite, the one I've read on here before, Jesus called his 12 disciples to him and gave them authority to drive out impure spirits and to heal every disease and sickness. These are the names of the 12 apostles. First Simon, who was called Peter, and his brother Andrew, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the tax collector, James, son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. These 12 Jesus sent out with the following instructions. Do not go among the Gentiles or enter any town of the Samaritans. Rather, go to the lost sheep of Israel. And as you go, proclaim this message. The kingdom of heaven has come near. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse those who have leprosy, drive out demons. Freely you have received, and freely you shall give. And do not get any gold or silver or copper to take with you in your belts, no bag for the journey, or extra shirt or sandals or a staff, for the worker is worth his keep. Whatever town or village you enter, search there for some worthy persons, and stay at their house until you leave. And as you enter the home, give it your greeting. And if the home is deserving, let your peace rest on it. And if it is not, let your peace return to it. If anyone will not welcome you or listen to your words, leave that home or town and shake the dust off your feet. Truly, I tell you, it will be more bearable for Sodom and Gomorrah on the day of judgment than for that town. I am sending you out like sheep among wolves. Therefore, be as shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves. Be on your guard. You will be handed over to the local councils and be flogged in the synagogues. On my account, you will be brought before governors and kings as witnesses to them and to the Gentiles. But when they arrest you, do not worry about what to say or how to say it. At the time, you will be given what to say, for it will not be you speaking, but the Spirit of your Father speaking through you. Brother will betray brother to death, and a father his child. Children will rebel against their parents and have them put to death. You will be hated by everyone because of me, but the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. And when you are persecuted in one place, flee to another. Truly, I tell you, you will not finish going through the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. The student is not above the teacher, nor the servant above his master. It is enough for the students to be like their teachers, and for the servants to be like their masters. If the head of the house has been called Beelzebub, how much more the members of his household? So do not be afraid for them, for there is nothing concealed that will not be disclosed, or hidden that will not be made known. What I tell you in the dark, speak in the daylight. What is whispered in your ear, proclaim from the roofs. Do not be afraid of those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather be afraid of the one who can destroy both soul and body in hell. You are not two sparrows sold for a penny. You are not one of them will fall through the ground outside your Father's care. And even the very hairs of your head are numbered. So do not be afraid. You are worth more than many sparrows. Whoever acknowledges me before others, I will acknowledge before my Father in heaven. But whoever disowns me before others, I will disown before my Father in heaven. Do not suppose that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to turn a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies will be members of his own household. And anyone who loves their mother or father more than me is not worthy of me. And anyone who loves their son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever does not take up their cross and follow me is not worthy of me. And whoever finds their life will lose it. And whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. And anyone who welcomes me And anyone who welcomes you welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. And whoever welcomes a prophet as a prophet will receive a prophet's reward. And whoever welcomes a righteous person as a righteous person will receive a righteous person's reward. And if anyone gives even a cup of water to one of these little ones who is my disciple, truly I tell you, that person will certainly not lose their reward. So don't let them ever tell you that Christianity and capitalism are compatible, because I just read you verse after verse after verse. New Testament, Old Testament, Gospels, Revelations, letters. There is strong opposition to capitalism in the Bible, no doubt about it. Just like there was strong opposition to capitalism from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., there is strong opposition to capitalism in the pages of the Bible. Do not let anyone tell you that the system of capitalism is compatible with Christianity. And not everyone who watches these streams is religious, right? There's many people that watch these streams that are atheists. I was an atheist for a while. There are many people who watch these streams who are Jewish, who are Muslim, who are Hindu, who are pagan. I respect all religious beliefs, but it's important that we make clear that capitalism and Christianity are not compatible, because often the way a lot of working people in the United States are deceived and manipulated by the rich and powerful is by telling them that their religion, the religion of capitalism, the religion of Christianity somehow preaches capitalism. And that's simply not true. But I want to finish out my opening remarks by reading from this book. A lot of people don't know about this book. I have this book, The Rise and Fall of the U.S. Communist Party, where I talk about the history of the Communist Party of the United States, from the founding in 1919 up until today. And it's a lecture. It's not an academic work. It's like a lecture that I gave in New York City. And I want to read you the most important part. I think the most important part of this book is the fighting years, 1928 through 1935. And it's extremely important. It's extremely important, this section of my history of the Communist Party. It's extremely important what I'm about to read to you. Because right now, the moratorium on evictions and home foreclosures has expired. Because of the pandemic, they put a freeze on kicking Americans out of their homes. That freeze expired on July 31st. And there are millions, literally millions of American families that are right now afraid about being thrown out on the street. They are afraid that they will be out on the street. There are people who've lost their jobs. There are mothers with children. There are families that risk being thrown out on the street. And of course, this isn't the first time this has happened in U.S. history. It's happened before. And I want to read to you what an amazing organization called the Communist Party of the United States, how they responded to a situation like that back in the 1930s. I am going to read to you how revolutionaries, and thank you, Sharon Pitts, thank you for your super chat, how revolutionaries respond to a situation like this. Learn your history. We had to fight for everything we have, folks. We had to fight for everything we have. Do you think the bosses and the bankers gave us Social Security because they care about us? Do you think the bosses and the bankers gave us unemployment insurance because they care about us? Do you think we have food stamps today because the bosses and the bankers and the millionaires were compassionate and thought it was a good idea? No. We have fought for everything we have. There's nothing we have we didn't fight for. Nothing we have that we, the working class, did not fight for. Sometimes I feel like the working class of the United States has forgot how to fight. We've been robbed of our history. When I was a kid, I didn't even know there was a Communist Party in the United States. I was taught that nobody believes in communism. It failed everywhere. When I found out that there was actually a U.S. Communist Party, I was a kid, and I was like, wow, there's actually a Communist Party in the United States. I was blown away. Well, there definitely was. There definitely was a Communist Party in the United States. And they're the reason that we have unemployment insurance. They're the reason that we have food stamps. They are the reason that workers had good paying industrial jobs at one time before the deindustrialization of the country. And I am now going to read you how the Communist Party responded to a similar situation when millions of Americans were out on the street, when millions of Americans were hungry. I am going to read you the history of America that has been robbed from us. It's from my Rise and Fall of the U.S. Communist Party. This is Chapter 3. When the stock market... Japanese communists in World War II. All right. When the stock market crashed in 1929, a crisis of mass unemployment swept the United States. Real starvation and homelessness swept the country. Small farmers were foreclosed by banks. The wages of industrial workers drastically fell as millions of unemployed workers were available to replace them. In response to the Great Depression, and armed with a new tactical orientation called the United Front from Below, the Communist Party swung into action. The Communists organized unemployment councils in almost every major city in the United States. The unemployment councils staged almost daily hunger marches, storming into the offices of elected officials chanting, "Work or wages now." Here's a picture of the unemployment councils. Look at that. They're wearing suits. They're poor people who are hungry. They're wearing suits, and they say, "We want to be citizens, not transients." The unemployed councils battled the police and sheriffs to stop evictions. On March 6, 1930, the Communist International declared International Unemployment Day, and mass rallies demanding jobs took place in every major city throughout the United States and Europe. The unemployed movement that swept the United States from 1929 to 1934 was completely controlled by the Communist Party. The slogan was, "Don't starve, fight." In Alabama, the unemployed staged a massive demonstration led by Angelo Herndon, a 19-year-old African-American youth who had joined the Communist Party after he saw a communist poster that proclaimed the death penalty for lynchers. As 4,000 unemployed workers stormed the Alabama state capitol, the government officials panicked and immediately announced thousands of dollars in relief money. Angelo Herndon was then charged and sentenced to death under a law passed during the time of slavery that forbid urging insurrection from black people. Herndon became an international celebrity. After a huge campaign, the U.S. Supreme Court stopped his execution and freed him in 1937. 110,000 people assembled in Union Square in New York City on March 6, 1931, for International Unemployment Day. G.K. Chesterton. The police had denied a parade permit. Led by the communists, the crowd proceeded to battle the police, eventually marching from Union Square to City Hall. Police on horseback were knocked over as the Young Communist League released a barrage of marbles. During the following year, the Communist Party formed the Bonus Army. 43,000 unemployed veterans traveled to Washington, D.C., and occupied the National Mall from June 17th to July 28th of 1932. The veterans demanded that they be paid veterans' benefits and were led by James W. Ford, an African-American World War I veteran who later ran for president on the vice president on the Communist Party ticket. The great-grandson of Abraham Lincoln joined with the bonus marchers. On July 28th, the Washington, D.C. police tried to evict the marchers and opened fire, killing 2 veterans, William Hushka and Eric Carlson. After 2 people were killed, the bonus army still refused to leave, so President Hoover sent in the U.S. Army, who violently cleared the encampment with tear gas, nausea gas, and bayonets. In Detroit, a crowd of protesters from the local unemployment council and the Young Communist League assembled outside of Henry Ford's mansion, demanding that he use some of his money to provide food for the thousands of auto workers who'd recently been laid off. Henry Ford's private security guards opened fire on the protesters with machine guns, killing 4 of them. Everyone knew the unemployment councils, the bonus army, and the rest of the huge economic relief movement was controlled by the Communist Party. The Communist Party refused to allow the Socialist Party or other leftist groups to join their mass organizations. The line of the Communist International was that Social Democrats preached socialism but practiced fascism and helped capitalism by pointing workers away from revolution. Fistfights between the Communist Party and rival leftist groups were very common. Trotskyists and anarchists often attempted to disrupt meetings of the Communist Party and were removed. Communist Party members were also known to disrupt and protest meetings of Trotskyites and the Socialist Party, who they referred to as social fascists. As part of the United Front from Below tactic, the Communist Party stopped trying to work within the existing labor unions that were led by Social Democrats. Instead, they formed their own labor union federation called the Trade Union Unity League and attempted to form communist-controlled unions. In Gastonia, North Carolina, the communists organized textile workers. The communists demanded equal treatment for black and white workers in the textile mills and organized a multiracial union. The National Textile Workers Union included the recognition of the Soviet Union and the creation of socialism in its official program. In Gastonia, the houses the workers lived in were owned by the textile company, and when the workers went on strike for better pay, they were evicted from their homes. For months, the striking textile workers lived in tents, refusing to go back to work and fighting off the sheriffs. Eventually, a local sheriff was killed in a shootout with the strikers. Communist organizer Fred Bale fled to the Soviet Union to avoid going to prison. Ella Mae Wiggins, a white single mother of 9 children who worked in the textile mills, was the most prominent leader of the North Carolina strike. She loudly championed racial equality and wrote songs about fighting the bosses. She was assassinated by company thugs on her way to a union meeting. By 1934, the mass uprising had expanded beyond the unemployed and Southern workers to the industrial workers. In San Francisco, the Communist Party leader Samuel Darcy joined with Harry Bridges to lead a general strike. The dock workers rejected the conservative leaders of their union and went on strike, and workers across the city struck in solidarity. The bosses were unable to use black workers as scabs because the black community supported the strike. Black communist leaders had a great deal of influence in San Francisco. The communist-controlled Longshore Union included the hiring of black workers in the strike's demands. The Longshore strike was successful, and dock workers won union representation in a hiring hall. The International Longshore Warehouse Union on the West Coast remains one of the most radical labor unions to this day. The San Francisco General Strike in the summer of 1934 took place alongside the General Strike in Minneapolis, led by Trotskyites, and the Toledo Auto Light Strike, led by a small social democratic group called the American Workers' Party. In the summer of 1934, textile workers went on strike across the South, led by the Communist Party's National Textile Union. After a mass strike wave in 1934, the Roosevelt administration began to take action to appease labor activists and unemployed workers. Roosevelt passed the Wagner Act, a federal law that said if the majority of workers voted to have union representation, they were entitled to it. In 1935, Roosevelt also created the Works Progress Administration and hired millions of unemployed workers. The unemployed workers wore bright green uniforms, built post offices, paved roads, and did other useful work around the country. In the early 1930s, the Communist Party was a household name across the country. The Soviet Union was becoming a world industrial power, and many people joined the Communist Party out of admiration for it. Electrical engineers, architects, agricultural scientists, painters and dance instructors, musicians, athletic coaches, and other skilled people from the United States were frequently hired by the Soviet government as the economy rapidly expanded with economic programs called five-year plans. If people liked what they saw in the Soviet Union, it seemed like the logical thing to do to join the Communist Party once they returned to the United States. And Soviet government officials generally suggested they do so. Being a communist was not an easy life. It meant working a full-time job in industry with other communists who were organized into shop nuclei or cells. It meant spending your evenings and mornings selling the Daily Worker newspaper to everyone in your neighborhood. The party maintained very strict policies of democratic centralism. Members were expected to repeat the party line at all times, no matter what they personally believed, reserving any disagreements only for internal discussions. The Communist Party's support among African Americans rapidly expanded during this period, and the party put forward its famous Black Belt thesis. The Communist Party program stated that the regions of the U.S. South that were majority African American had the right to secede from the United States as a means of granting self-determination to the oppressed black nation. The demand for an independent Negro Soviet republic in the South was popular with many black nationalists. Similar demands were adopted by the Nation of Islam, the Republic of New Africa, and other African American organizations. Here's actually a Communist Party poster. Equal rights for Negroes everywhere. It has the map of the Black Belt. Right? Self-determination for the Black Belt, vote communist, William Z. Foster and James W. Ford. This was an actual election campaign of the Communist Party. It was their election campaign poster. During the 1932 presidential campaign, the Communist Party put up posters with a map of the future United Soviet States of America. In some versions of this poster, the capital of the USA was Chicago, an industrial city in the center of the country. Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi were an independent black republic where land was redistributed to the descendants of slaves. The slogan of the Communist Party's 1932 presidential campaign was, "For a revolutionary way out of the crisis." William Z. Foster traveled across the United States giving speeches about the need for a Soviet America where unemployment and hunger would be eliminated. In almost every town he visited for his presidential campaign, William Z. Foster was arrested. In Los Angeles, the police tortured him for hours before releasing him. What's this? Sam Cedar said he would love to include a socialist communist on the MR. I think it would be great. Reach out. Absolutely. I'd happily go on with Sam Cedar. Over 103,000 people voted for the Communist Party in the 1932 presidential election, even though the communists were banned from the ballot in most southern states because they advocated racial equality. After the presidential campaign of 1932, Foster had a heart attack and a psychological breakdown as a result of extreme stress. He went to the Soviet Union to recover. Earl Browder, the party's general secretary, stepped up to lead the party. Earl Browder was an anti-war activist from Kansas who had been imprisoned for refusing to fight in the First World War. For the 1932 convention of the Communist Party, the famous African-American poet Langston Hughes wrote a poem. "Put one more S in the USA. Let's make it Soviet. Put one more S in the USA. Oh, we can win it yet. And the land belongs to the farmers and the factories to working men. The USA, when we take control, will be the USSA then." That is from my book, The Rise and Fall of the Communist Party. The rise and fall of the Communist Party, of the U.S. Communist Party. And this is what we should be studying, because right now there are millions of American working families that are in danger of losing their homes. And now is the time to bring back some of that class struggle, resistance spirit of working people. We need a government of action to fight for working families. We need a government of action to fight for working families. We need a government of action that will fight for working families. Shout out to the John Brown volunteers who are out on the streets of New York and soon to be dispatched to other cities, spreading the word. They just got a big sound system. They've just got a big, expensive sound system that they're doing street preaching with. And they are out there distributing buttons, and they are out there, spreading the message of the Center for Political Innovation every day. I am so proud of these kids. Never been prouder. They study every day. I'm so proud of them. If you want to help them out, you can send them a Cash App donation, $ John Brown Volunteers, or you can send me, send it to me. You want to send me on PayPal at calebmaupin, at gmail.com. It's happening, folks. The moment is here. The class struggle is happening, and it's time to swing into motion. It's time to take up that forgotten tradition of class struggle. Workers against the bosses, resistance, popular working class power. That was from my book on the Communist Party. I just read you earlier what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said about capitalism. I just read you what the Bible and Jesus Christ said about capitalism. We need a government of action to fight for working families. Now is the time for the working class to swing into motion. And those are my opening remarks, folks. Names and locations, names and locations, names and locations. I will call you out as I see you, names and locations. Who's with us tonight? And then I'll start answering the super chats. Who's with us tonight? Who is with us tonight? Names and locations. Who's with us? Temple City, California. Arturo in Alaska. Max the Sax. Nate in Chicago. Burbank, California. Tristan in Maryland. Northern New Jersey. Kansas City, Missouri. KCMO. A hotel in Brooklyn, says Chaya. Very good. I hope I get to chill with you pretty soon. Space Coast, Florida. Fred in Alameda, California. Long Island City, Queens. 31st Century Socialism. Wisconsin. Brad in St. Louis. Jenny Lynn in Ohio. Tamara and Dario from Brooklyn. I hope I get to meet you soon, too. Max in D.C. Rocky from Reno. Aloha from Hawaii, says Robert Webb. Great. Eva, good friend of the show, from NYC. Chris from his office in Pennsylvania. North Central West Virginia, Samuel. Milek in Poland. Jay from Philly. Io in New York. Can anyone pronounce Winnemucca? I don't think I can. Sweden. Natalie from Maryland. Harpelbrar article almost done. I can't wait to see it, Natalie. Daniel from Round Rock, Texas. Vinicius from Brazil. Zachary in Finland. St. David's, Bermuda. Southwest Michigan. Sharon from Alabama. Kim Jong-un from North Korea. I'm sure that's the real one. I'm sure that's really him. Ha 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 ha. All right. LPCBNC. Not sure what any of those initials stand for. Dana Annex in Chicago. Shout out to you, Dana Annex in Chicago. Balthazar in Oakland. Mary in West Virginia. Fakio in Montreal. Vilnius in Lithuania. Los Angeles. Kinky in the high desert of California. Mons, Germany. Calgary, Canada. Steve from Southwest Michigan. John in Denver. Sacramento, California. Morbid fear of COVID. Kendall in San Diego. Happy Valley, Oregon. Detroit, Motor City. Caleb, did you did it? I don't know what that means, Kevin. There you go. Andy in Maine. Sasa from Serbia. That was correct. Sam in Chicago. Alan from Chicago. Mr. Worldwide. USA is working with Wahhabi terrorists. MLK was a hero, not for his fight for civil rights, but for his fight for economic justice. I think he's a hero for both. Come on. Ron in Design Studio, St. George, North Central Valley. LP from California. James from PA. Joe Gale, good friend of the show. Joe Gale out in Nassau County, Mexico. Connecticut, Northern Michigan. Turkey, H-Town. Beach in California. Snoop Dogg. Tim Stacy out in Kentucky. John Q from New Orleans. The Philippines. Julian in East Sussex, UK. Wow. Always a broad audience. Heavy Dukes, NYC. Always all over the United States and all over the world, we've got people who are attracted to our message of constructive, optimistic socialism. I get on here and stream as much as I can. You are going to keep hearing from me. I am not going to stop. I'm going to keep going. Carolina Beach, North Carolina. People have been predicting my departure from politics for a long time. All right? People thought when I left Cleveland, that would be the end of me. And I reappeared in New York City as a big part of the Occupy Wall Street movement. And after the Occupy Wall Street movement, people thought that would be the last of me. And they saw me on CNN talking about Syria. And they saw me marching through the streets of the city and marching to the White House. I even know there's a clip of me from the White House they're using in one of their Netflix propaganda documentaries. I was in front of the White House talking about Syria. And then people, when I started working as a journalist, people thought, oh, that's the last we'll hear of him. He's got a comfy job as a journalist. That's the last we're going to hear of him. And then all of a sudden, I was on a ship from Iran going to Yemen to deliver humanitarian aid. And John Kerry was on the phone with the Iranian foreign minister, furious that an Occupy Wall Street kid was risking his life trying to bring aid to the people of Yemen. And then, when my relationship with a certain Marxist group came to an end, people thought, oh, that's the end of him. And then they kept seeing more from me. Now I'm on YouTube all the time. I've got top-selling books. BreadTube Serves Imperialism, my critique of the fake internet socialists of BreadTube. It was a #1 new release on anarchism. Hundreds and hundreds of copies have sold so far. It just keeps selling. It won't stop. We are on fire, folks. The Center for Political Innovation now has a full-time outreach team that are on the streets of this city spreading the revolutionary message. I am not stopping. I am not stopping. I am not going away. I get knocked down, but I get up again, and you're not going to hold me down. I am going to keep coming, and every time you knock me down, I gather strength from the earth, and I come back 10 times bigger. This is exciting. What is happening here is unstoppable. It is unstoppable. Our message of optimistic, constructive socialism, pushing back against the lies of capitalism, pushing back against the lies of imperialism, pushing back against the fake synthetic left, the fake socialists that speak in the name of socialism while defending the imperialists. We are not going away. We are marching ahead. We are on fire. We are on fire, and we are not going to stop. We are marching forward. We are marching forward. We are not stopping. If you think I am going to go away, if you think that I am going to disappear, you are wrong. You are wrong. You are wrong in 2010. You were wrong in 2013. You were wrong in 2014. You were wrong in 2015. You were wrong in 2016. You were wrong in 2018 and 2019. You were wrong in 2020. You're wrong in 2021. And you're going to be wrong in 2022 and 2023 and 2024. You're going to be wrong in 2050. You're going to be wrong in 2060. You're going to be wrong in 2080. I will not stop. We are marching forward. We need a government of action that will fight for working families. We need a government of action that will fight for working families. We need a government of action that will fight for working families. Imperialism is doomed. Imperialism is doomed. And on that note, folks, I'm going to start answering your Super Chat questions. So keep them rolling in. I will answer your Super Chat questions as they come in. And the longer you keep asking questions, the longer I stay on here and chat with all of you. The first question that I have written down is neoliberalism tainting leftism, extreme examples. Well, the most extreme example that I can think of, the most extreme example of neoliberal ideology tainting leftism is the topic of Chapter 4 of BreadTube Serves Imperialism. The fourth chapter of BreadTube Serves Imperialism is called Understanding Left Pessimism. There's a question I've wanted to ask you for weeks. I keep forgetting. So here's some cash that might spark something into my head. All right. Well, if you remember it, ask me. Chapter 4, left pessimism, mostly focuses on degrowth delusions. Socialism has always been an ideology that is about economic growth. It is about promoting economic growth. It's about lifting the artificial restraints imposed on human growth by the irrationality of capitalism. It's about having rational use of resources, a rationally planned and organized economy, so that poverty can be eradicated and growth and human innovation and creativity can expand to far greater heights than ever before. That's what Marxism and socialism has always been about. Marxism and socialism are about economic growth. The goal of socialism is to create a world with so much material abundance, so much economic growth, that the need for the state withers away. We want there to be so much prosperity, so much abundance, that the need for a government can fade away, that people can live just according to his needs, each according to his own ability, to each according to his needs. That's the goal, a world of so much material abundance that the state can wither away, the higher stage of communism. That's the goal. That is the goal of Marxism. That's the goal. That is the goal. So the greatest example of people adopting neoliberal economics and still claiming to be leftists is the belief that somehow socialism wants people to be poorer, that somehow degrowth is consistent with the Marxist ideology, that somehow making everyone have less, reducing human consumption, reducing the human population, rolling back the wheels of history, somehow that's consistent with what we believe. And it's not. It is not. It has never been consistent with what we believe. Marxism has always been an optimistic ideology about growth. And yes, we need to change the way we interact with our environment. Fossil fuels are not sustainable. They're not, right? We need to get to a higher mode of production. We need to get to higher and more efficient ways of doing it. But Marxism is about growth. And if you're a degrowther, you're on the right. You are a right-winger. You are a conservative. You are a reactionary if you are a degrowther. Fusion City now. Fusion City now. Fusion City must be built. Fusion City now. All right. The process of small countries joining the USSR, Bulgaria. Bulgaria was never part of the USSR. Bulgaria was a socialist country, but it was not part of the Soviet Union. So the person who asked that question did not know what they were talking about. Bulgaria was always, it was a socialist country until the fall of socialism, but it was never a part of the Soviet Union. Bulgaria was independent, right? After Bulgaria was liberated, by Soviet troops from the Nazis, Georgy Dimitrov, who'd been a leader of the Communist International, who had been jailed by Hitler and had been freed, he became the leader of socialist Bulgaria. And actually, Bulgaria has a lot to do with me becoming a communist, because when I was a small kid, like elementary school age, my family hosted a college student from Bulgaria, and he was not a communist. He was a college student from Bulgaria. He was not a communist by any means, but I asked him at the time, being a small child, why did anyone in Bulgaria support communism? And were there people that still supported communism? And this Bulgarian student that my family was hosting, he proceeded to tell us that his grandfather was a huge supporter of communism. And I asked why. And he said, because after World War II, the Communist Party in Bulgaria had mobilized the whole population to build roads. And there was a mass mobilization. And his grandfather remembered how the country had not had paved roads before that. His grandfather had been a young man at the time and had been part of that mobilization to go out and pave the roads. And it was when the country was mobilized to build roads, build hospitals, and build schools, and the whole country was pulling together to industrialize, His grandfather felt like that was the greatest time in his life, and that's why his grandfather was an unrepentant communist. So there you go. All right, Fusion City, unrealistic. So there you go. And because of that, his grandfather was always sympathetic to communism. I had no idea that communism had paved the roads of Bulgaria. I had no idea that communism had built the hospitals and wiped out illiteracy in so many countries. And that was the very first inclination I had of the economic achievements of socialism. I had always been told, Martin Luther, I had always been told that communism had failed everywhere it had ever been tried, never had a single economic success. And when he told me about how his grandfather loved the Communist Party in Bulgaria because they had mobilized to build the roads, I thought that was amazing. I guess I've always been a bit of a city builder at heart. I grew up in a rural area, small town, but the best experiences I had when I was a kid going to visit my uncle who lived in Chicago, this big metropolitan area, was always such a thrill. To go to a city where there was, my uncle was a professor, a theater professor who lived in Evanston, which is a suburb of Chicago. When I was a kid, when we went to visit my uncle who lived in Evanston, it was an amazing experience. I loved the thrill of the cities. I have always been a city builder at heart. And so when I heard from this student from Bulgaria about how his grandfather was a strong supporter of the Communist Party because of all the mass construction work that they had mobilized, how they had really improved the lives of the people of Bulgaria, that was the first time I felt sympathetic to communism in my life. So there you go. I was not a communist yet, and I will tell that story another time. But there you go. All right. The creation of millionaires under socialism created ruling. Okay. All right. Creation. Millionaires create a ruling class, power to manipulate and buy. Creation of socialism. Creation of millionaires. Socialism create a new ruling class with ability to buy government. Very good. It's a long question, but it's a good one, and I will answer it. Very good question. Next question. Is modern Russia on the path to socialism? Well, I've answered this question many, many times before, and I will answer it again. Modern Russia does not consider itself to be a socialist country. They are critical of Western capitalism, but modern Russia is an Orthodox country. The Orthodox Christianity is the state religion. The Communist Party is a part of the government, but they are not the ruling party any longer. There is a huge amount of economic planning. The economy is structured around the state-run oil company and the state-run natural gas company. The state is directing a big farming boom right now. There's a huge expansion of agriculture. There are state-run industries, but overall, the outlook of the Russian government is not a Marxist one. They do not put forward a Marxist perspective, and they do not consider themselves to be a socialist country. All righty. Martin Luther King Jr. on Christianity and communism. Well, in Martin Luther King's day, the Soviet Union and the countries aligned with it were largely atheist countries, right? Communism at that point was associated with hard atheism. And in his speeches on the question of socialism and capitalism, Martin Luther King Jr. criticized Marx for his interpretation of Hegel, right? Hegel is the father of the dialectical philosophy. And you have to remember there was a divide among the Hegelians. There were the right Hegelians and the left Hegelians, right? And that most of Hegel's writing was about the Christian religion. Not most of it, a lot of Hegel's writings are about Christianity. And Hegel's lectures on Christianity are very important. I've read some of them, and it's good stuff. And that Hegel believed in historical progress. He believed in the concept of the dialectic and the clash between ideas leading to historical progress. Hegel believed that Christianity was the most advanced religion and that the German nation state and Germany was the most advanced part of the world. And there were then various interpretations of Hegel. And Marx was from the left Hegelian school. And Martin Luther King Jr. was also heavily influenced by the teachings of Hegel and the philosophy of Hegel, but he argued that Marx had distorted those teachings, and that Marx, who interpreted Hegel as leading to kind of atheistic and atheistic conclusions, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. argued that Marx had misinterpreted Hegel, and that Martin Luther King Jr. was a pacifist. Martin Luther King Jr. very much believed that ideas were the defining course of history. Marx argued that economics is the defining course of history and that ideas are a reflection of underlying economic base, whereas Martin Luther King Jr. Believed that ideas can override the economic base and that ideas are the motor force of history. Marx argued that economics are the motivating force of history. So yes, no one said Martin Luther King Jr. was a Marxist. He was definitely not that. He was a socialist. He was a critic of capitalism. And he was an anti-imperialist, if you read his Beyond Vietnam speech. But Martin Luther King Jr. was not a Marxist. He rejected Marxism. He did work with Marxists, though. He was happy to work. He went to a communist training school. He worked with people, people associated with communism, people associated with the Communist Party. And at the time, he was red baited for that. Just like people bashed me for talking to somebody, they did the same thing back during the 1960s when Martin Luther King was alive. They were constantly attacking him because he would work with people that were communists and socialists. He was happy to work with them. One of Martin Luther King's most key strategists was a man named Bayard Rustin. Bayard Rustin. And Bayard Rustin had been a member of the Communist Party. At one point, he quit. But Bayard Rustin was also gay. And so Martin Luther King had to kind of keep his relationship, his friendship. They were never, partners or anything like that. But his friendship with Bayard Rustin kind of a secret because Bayard Rustin had at one point been a member of the Communist Party. And Bayard Rustin also was gay. So there you go. All righty. Saif Gaddafi and Libya's presidency. Well, Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, that was the son of Gaddafi. The son of Gaddafi, he was kind of the more reform-oriented son. He was, probably the son who was the most sympathetic to some of the protests against Gaddafi. He was for some kind of democratic reforms in Libya, and he is now, a figure in Libyan politics. And there are millions of Libyans who like Saif Gaddafi and think that he's the best, for the country. There's millions who don't think he's so good. And he's a little bit mixed, right? I mean, on the one hand, he was seen as the reform-oriented, but many people interpret that as being more pro-Western, right? That while there were different figures within the Gaddafi government, Saif Gaddafi was one of the more pro-Western and pro-reformist voices. Whereas, there were other figures, other children of Gaddafi, other people in the military who were considered more hardline and anti-imperialist and socialist. So it's complicated. Saif Gaddafi is certainly a complicated figure. But at the end of the day, the imperialists hate him because everyone knows what his last name is. And everyone knows who his father was. And so he's basically an anti-imperialist figure in Libya.